If we were to have another event like the event that happened 12,800 years ago, I can say with absolute confidence that our civilization would not survive it. Scholars who attempt to investigate the possibility of a past cataclysm often find themselves in the crosshairs of very vicious attacks from their colleagues. The mammoths, the mastodons, the saber-toothed tigers, the giant sloths, all of these creatures were in the world until 12,800 years ago, and then they were gone. Overnight. Very, very radical, rapid change. In dealing with history, and particularly in dealing with prehistory, there is a difference because history is based primarily upon written documents. And prehistory, you're dealing with objects, artifacts that are dug up out of the ground. I began to realize how ideological this is. That actually when I'm dealing with academics, with archaeologists or professional skeptics of any kind, I'm dealing with people who already have an ideological position. And that ideological position is confronted by the position I take. So in an ideological war, what you try to do is to destroy your opponent in any way, fair or foul. And it's helped me to understand that there is an ideological war over our past. For example, when it comes to large-scale animal extinctions, which happened at the end of the Ice Age, what they call the megafauna, the mammoths, the mastodons, the saber-toothed tigers, the giant sloths, all of these creatures were in the world until 12,800 years ago. And then they were gone. Overnight. Very, very radical, rapid change. Now, the mainstream, for some reason in this ideology, doesn't like cataclysms. It doesn't like cataclysmic events. It doesn't want to think that that cataclysms have played a role in the human story. So seeking for a way to explain the disappearance of the megafauna, the natural option for mainstream archaeologists is to say, oh, that was human predation that did it. That was human hunting that did it. And suddenly we're required to picture a group of hunter-gatherers who are so incredibly efficient and so ruthless that they wipe out the entire megafauna of, for example, North America in a matter of months. I don't know any hunter-gatherer community that behaves that way. They respect their prey. They live with them, they codepend upon them, they don't wipe them out. What does wipe them out is a giant comet impact, which melts the ice sheets and causes huge flooding over North America. So there's a tendency in the study of prehistory to want to keep the past kind of nice and calm and just the way it is now. There's even a word for it, it's called uniformitarianism, and it's a doctrine. That things should have unfolded in the past, much in the way that we see them unfolding now. So if we don't have any giant cataclysms happening in the earth now, then there wouldn't have been any cataclysms in the past. And yeah, we know about the dinosaurs and they were made extinct by an asteroid, but that was 65 million years ago. Surely within the human story there's been no such thing. And as a result, scholars who attempt to investigate the possibility of a past cataclysm often find themselves in the crosshairs of very vicious attacks from their colleagues, as though somehow they're upsetting the apple cart in some way, and as though we shouldn't think about these things. I don't think that it's deliberate, planned censorship.
Right.
I think it's the mindset of the individuals who we have entrusted with interpreting our history for us. And that is a mindset that is troubled by cataclysms. It doesn't want them to have happened, whether consciously or subconsciously, and looks for other reasons to explain why things are the way they are.
Yeah, it's important you say that, because it's not, in your mind, that conspiracy. It's
I
just
don't think so.
A natural tendency for them to shy away from these things.
Yes.
Because also, keeping things in the status quo keeps everything
Yes.
the way it should be.
Yes.
Keeps them in their same jobs, their institutions alive.
Absolutely.
And so they just naturally become uncomfortable
Yeah.
and resist when they hear these new theories.
Very much so. And this is a classic example that I go into in this new book of archaeology going radically, drastically wrong. And it's partly connected to that so-called overkill theory, where the megafauna were supposedly wiped out by this ruthless hunter-gatherer population. And it's an archaeological theory called Clovis first. And it dominated American archaeology for 50 years. The notion that there's a culture that archaeologists call the Clovis culture. We don't know what they call themselves. They're called the Clovis culture because what's called the type site, the classic site that they were at, is near the town of Clovis, New Mexico, in a place called Blackwater Draw, near Clovis, New Mexico. And apparently the archaeologists needed to go to Clovis to get beer, so they called it the Clovis culture. And this Clovis culture, there's no evidence of it in North America before 13,600 years ago. It flourishes for about 800 years, and 12,800 years ago, it vanishes completely from the picture. The position of archaeology for 50 years is those were the first human beings to enter America. No human beings entered the Americas before 13,600 years ago. And those are the same archaeologists who repeatedly called me a pseudoscientist or a pseudo-archaeologist for suggesting other possibilities. But lo and behold, what do we find? Round about 2010 onwards, the evidence becomes overwhelming that Clovis was not first at all, not first by even a tiny margin, a huge margin, first by a huge margin, not 25,000, 35,000, 50,000. As part of the research for this book, I went to the San Diego Natural History Museum and interviewed Dr. Tom Desmarais, who's the chief paleontologist there. The reason I interviewed him was because he'd just had an extraordinary paper published in Nature in April 2017. And that paper documents human presence in North America 130,000 years ago. That's 10 times as old as the Clovis culture. And all archaeologists admit this now, that the Clovis first was a mistake. They got it wrong, completely wrong. Human beings have been in America for much longer than that. But what they don't comment upon is the careers that were ruined as a result. People like Jacques Saint-Mars, who excavated Bluefish Caves in the Yukon. He had his career literally ripped to shreds by his colleagues because he was proposing humans in America 25,000 years ago. He had his research funding withdrawn. He could only continue on his own buck. Nobody was supporting him, but he was right. He was right, and this happens again and again. So when archaeologists of that type say, Hancock is a pseudoscientist, I say, hang on a minute, you guys are the pseudoscientists. You guys sold us Clovis first for 50 years. You guys withdrew funding from research that might have exposed that lie earlier. You wouldn't let it happen. And that's not right. It shouldn't be that way. Archaeologists should not take the view that they have got a firm and fixed picture of the past, because actually we know so little about the past. They should always be saying this is our provisional position, but we are open to other possibilities. Because if they don't say that, those other possibilities are going to come along and kick them in the ass pretty soon. And that's what's happened with Clovis first. And Clovis first is not a small matter, because if human beings have been in the Americas for 130,000 years instead of for 13,000 years, why, there's 100,000 plus years that archaeologists just haven't looked at because of their preconceived notion that there was going to be nothing to find. There was actually a dictum against digging below Clovis levels. You know how in archaeological strata it's like a layer cake, right, and you have certain levels. And the view was, let's not waste research funds digging below Clovis because we know there was nothing before Clovis. What an idiotic, what a ridiculous position to take. Those archaeologists who did risk it and who dug deeper, like Al Goodyear at Topper in the Carolinas, they found human stuff going back tens of thousands of years earlier. So, I think we're dealing with an ideological discipline, and I think it should be more provisional in what it says and in what it claims, and it should be less despising of people who consider other possibilities, because that's a useful thing to do. It's useful to consider other possibilities, even if they're wrong. Science should never get locked in a narrow channel and say everything outside the bounds of this channel is not subject to investigation. It's really a mistake.
I mean, I was surprised when you went to America with this book, because I thought, what's in America? You know, and because of all of the assumptions I had made and what I had been taught as a kid, the narratives was simple. As little as I knew that there was nothing else there
Exactly.
to talk
This
about.
was the view, and this is why America is so interesting, because what we have in the Americas, North and South America, is a gigantic landmass, enormously rich in resources, just the kind of place where a civilization could emerge. And then you take the Ice Age and you recognize that for very long periods the Americas were cut off from the rest of the world, but yet incredibly rich in resources. So now we know that there were human beings there from 130,000 years ago, and we know that archaeologists haven't been looking at what they were doing. Now's the time to ask, what were they doing? What was going on in the Americas in that time? And again, a need for archaeologists to be more humble. How much have they really looked at? Take the Mississippi Valley civilization, which plays an important role in this book. The famous sites are sites like Cahokia or Poverty Point, or the Ohio sites such as High Bank and Newark. Amazing, huge geometrical earthworks, absolutely stunning. But the trouble is that in the 18th and 19th and 20th centuries, there was massive, large-scale destruction of these ancient monuments. They were not considered to be worth preserving. The needs of agriculture and industry were more important. So what we can say is that round about 90% of the monuments that were in the Mississippi Valley in, say, 1700 are gone now. They're not there. So archaeologists, in drawing their conclusions about that culture, are drawing it on a tiny fraction that's randomly left by chance from the mass-scale wipeout that was caused. And then when the archaeologists come to it with preconceived ideas about what sort of culture it should be, that's another form of censorship that imposes itself upon the past. We should let the past speak for itself.
And was that just human destruction without people thinking about it? Why would
Well,
this
I mean, first of all, there was the view. You know, things have changed. We live in a different world today. But America in the 18th and 19th centuries was in an aggressively expansionist, expanding westward, and that involved taking the land of the indigenous inhabitants. Well, if you're going to take away, tens of millions of acres from people and stuff them somewhere else, then you need a good excuse to do so. So what you do is you depict them as savages, and you say that actually we're doing them a favor. There's a quote I put in the book concerning the horrific project called the boarding schools project in America, where Native American children, about 90% of them, were physically removed from their families and stuck in boarding schools in another state, far away, punished if they wore any traditional clothing, given the whole ideology of Western civilization, and encouraged to cut themselves off from their roots. Well, no wonder we're a species with amnesia if we take the entire cultural memory banks of the indigenous inhabitants of the Americas and deliberately wipe them out.